Snow fell lightly over the small town of Pinecrest, blanketing the streets in a perfect white sheet. Every house on the block was lit up with twinkling Christmas lights, except for one, an old, run-down home at the end of the street. For years, the house had been abandoned, its windows boarded up and its front yard overgrown. Locals said it was cursed, but nobody knew why. 12-year-old Ellie had heard the stories her entire life. They said if you stood outside the house on Christmas Eve and sang a Christmas carol, you'd hear someone singing back, a ghostly voice that didn't belong to anyone alive. It was Christmas Eve, and Ellie and her older brother, Max, were walking home from a friend's house. They passed the eerie home, its shadow looming in the moonlight. Max, always looking to scare her, stopped in front of the house. "Hey, Ellie," he said with a grin. "Let's test the legend. Sing a carol." Ellie shook her head. "No way. That house is creepy." "Come on," Max teased. "You're not scared, are you?" "I'm not scared," Ellie insisted, crossing her arms. "It's just dumb." Max rolled his eyes and started singing Silent Night, his voice echoing in the quiet street. Ellie tried to pull him away, but then it happened. A soft, distant voice joined in. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it sang perfectly in tune with Max. Both of them froze. Max stopped singing, but the voice continued, growing louder. It wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from right behind them. Ellie turned slowly, her breath visible in the freezing air. Behind them stood a figure, barely visible in the faint light. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned, tattered dress. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were dark and hollow. "Why did you stop?" the woman asked, her voice soft but chilling. "Please, keep singing." Max grabbed Ellie's arm. "We need to go," he whispered, pulling her away. But as they turned to run, the woman's voice rose into a mournful wail, echoing down the street. "Don't leave me alone," she cried, her voice filled with sorrow. Ellie looked back and saw the woman reaching out to them, her hand passing through the air like mist. She wasn't alive. She couldn't be. The siblings ran as fast as they could, not stopping until they reached their home. They slammed the door shut and locked it, their hearts racing. But when they turned around, they froze. The woman was standing in their living room, her hollow eyes fixed on them. "You woke me," she said softly. "Now you must finish the song." Max and Ellie were too terrified to speak, but the woman stepped closer, her presence filling the room with a cold that cut to their bones. "Every Christmas," she whispered, "I wait for someone to remember, to sing the song that was left unfinished." Ellie gathered her courage and stammered, "What song?" The woman's lips curled into a faint, haunting smile. "The carol I sang, the night I died." The siblings stared at her, too afraid to move. The woman raised her hand, and suddenly, music filled the room, a melody neither of them had ever heard before. It was beautiful, yet deeply sorrowful, like the sound of a soul trapped between worlds. "Sing with me," the woman urged. Her voice grew louder, and the room began to shake. Ornaments fell from the tree, and the lights flickered. Terrified but feeling they had no choice, Ellie and Max joined in, mimicking the haunting tune. As they sang, the woman's form began to fade, her voice growing softer. When the song ended, she was gone. The room grew silent, the air warm once more. The next morning, Ellie and Max told their parents everything. Their parents laughed it off as a wild dream, but when they went to the living room, they found something strange. Hanging on the Christmas tree was a new ornament, a delicate, glass angel with a sorrowful face. Neither of them had put it there. From that day on, Ellie and Max avoided the old house at the end of the street. But every Christmas Eve, they heard a faint melody in the distance, a song only they could recognize. Story 2 underscore 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 underscore. 12-year-old Ellie had heard the stories her entire life. They said if you stood outside the house on Christmas Eve and sang a Christmas carol, you'd hear someone singing back. A ghostly voice that didn't belong to anyone alive. It was Christmas Eve, and Ellie and her older brother, Max, were walking home from a friend's house. They passed the eerie home, its shadow looming in the moonlight. Max, always looking to scare her, stopped in front of the house. "Hey, Ellie," he said with a grin. "Let's test the legend. Sing a carol." Ellie shook her head. "No way. That house is creepy." "Come on," Max teased. "You're not scared, are you?" "I'm not scared," Ellie insisted, crossing her arms. "It's just dumb." Max rolled his eyes and started singing Silent Night, his voice echoing in the quiet street. Ellie tried to pull him away, but then it happened. A soft, distant voice joined in. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it sang perfectly in tune with Max. Both of them froze. Max stopped singing, but the voice continued, growing louder. It wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from right behind them. Ellie turned slowly, her breath visible in the freezing air. Behind them stood a figure, barely visible in the faint light. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned, tattered dress. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were dark and hollow. "Why did you stop?" the woman asked, her voice soft but chilling. "Please, keep singing." Max grabbed Ellie's arm. "We need to go," he whispered, pulling her away. But as they turned to run, the woman's voice rose into a mournful wail, echoing down the street. "Don't leave me alone," she cried, her voice filled with sorrow. Ellie looked back and saw the woman reaching out to them, her hand passing through the air like mist. She wasn't alive. She couldn't be. The siblings ran as fast as they could, not stopping until they reached their home. They slammed the door shut and locked it, their hearts racing. But when they turned around, they froze. The woman was standing in their living room, her hollow eyes fixed on them. "You woke me," she said softly. "Now you must finish the song." Max and Ellie were too terrified to speak, but the woman stepped closer, her presence filling the room with a cold that cut to their bones. "Every Christmas," she whispered, "I wait for someone to remember, to sing the song that was left unfinished." Ellie gathered her courage and stammered, "What song?" The woman's lips curled into a faint, haunting smile. "The carol I sang, the night I died." The siblings stared at her, too afraid to move. The woman raised her hand, and suddenly, music filled the room, a melody neither of them had ever heard before. It was beautiful, yet deeply sorrowful, like the sound of a soul trapped between worlds. "Sing with me," the woman urged. Her voice grew louder, and the room began to shake. Ornaments fell from the tree, and the lights flickered. Terrified but feeling they had no choice, Ellie and Max joined in, mimicking the haunting tune. As they sang, the woman's form began to fade, her voice growing softer. When the song ended, she was gone. The room grew silent, the air warm once more. The next morning, Ellie and Max told their parents everything. Their parents laughed it off as a wild dream, but when they went to the living room, they found something strange. Hanging on the Christmas tree was a new ornament, a delicate, glass angel with a sorrowful face. Neither of them had put it there. From that day on, Ellie and Max avoided the old house at the end of the street. But every Christmas Eve, they heard a faint melody in the distance, a song only they could recognize. Story 3. Winter in the small town of Harthwick was always picturesque. Snow-covered rooftops, twinkling lights strung across the streets, and children laughing as they built snowmen in their yards. But there was one snowman that no one dared to touch, the one that stood in the middle of Frost Hollow Field. The snowman had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Even during the warmest winters, when the rest of the snow melted, it remained, perfectly preserved, with its coal-black eyes and crooked carrot nose. Parents warned their children to stay away, claiming it was cursed. Some said it was just a story to keep kids out of the field, but others whispered about strange things that happened to those who got too close. 18-year-old Claire wasn't afraid of the snowman. She had grown up hearing the tales but dismissed them as silly folklore. On Christmas Eve, she and her two best friends, Mason and Lily, decided to debunk the myth once and for all. Come on, it's just a snowman, Claire said as they trudged through the snow. The moonlit field stretched out before them, the snowman standing ominously at its center. What's the worst that could happen? I don't know, Claire, Mason muttered, glancing around nervously. My dad told me a kid disappeared here years ago. They found his sled, but no footprints leading away. Yeah, and my grandma says she saw it move once, Lily added, clutching her coat tightly. This place gives me the creeps. Claire rolled her eyes. It's just a pile of snow. Let's go prove it and get back to the party. As they approached, the snowman loomed larger than they had realized. It was taller than any snowman they'd ever seen, with thick, branch-like arms and an oddly lifelike expression. Its coal eyes seemed to follow them as they circled it, and its mouth, a jagged line of stones, almost looked like it was smiling. See? Just a snowman, Claire said, reaching out to touch it. Wait! Lily cried. Don't! But it was too late. Claire pressed her hand against the snowman's side. The snow was icy cold, far colder than it should have been. She yanked her hand back, shivering. Okay, maybe it's a little creepy, she admitted. But it's not cursed. Just as the words left her mouth, the wind picked up, swirling snow around them. The temperature seemed to drop even further, and the field grew eerily quiet. Mason glanced back toward the town. We should go, he said. Now. Lily nodded, but Claire hesitated. Hold on, she said, noticing something strange. The snowman's smile, it had changed. The stones now formed a wicked grin, and its coal eyes glimmered in the moonlight. Did it just move? Mason whispered. Before anyone could answer, the snowman's head tilted slightly, its gaze locking onto Claire. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding. No way, she breathed. It's just the wind. But then it moved again, this time twisting its entire body to face them. The snow around its base shifted, almost as if it were taking a step forward. Run! Lily screamed, grabbing Claire's arm. The three of them bolted, racing through the snow as the wind howled around them. Claire glanced back and froze in terror. The snowman was no longer standing in the field. It was moving, gliding across the snow with unnatural speed. It's following us, she shouted. Mason and Lily didn't look back. They ran as fast as they could, the snow crunching beneath their boot. But the snowman was gaining on them, its coal eyes glowing brighter with each passing second. They reached the edge of the field and scrambled onto the road, but the snowman didn't stop. It crossed the boundary as if the field's legend meant nothing, its jagged grin stretching wider. This way, Mason yelled, leading them toward an old barn at the edge of town. They ducked inside and slammed the door shut, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Is it gone? Lily whispered, peering through a crack in the wooden plank. Claire joined her, but the snowman was nowhere to be seen. The field was empty, the snow pristine, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. Maybe we imagined it, Mason said, though he didn't sound convinced. But then a low, grinding sound filled the barn, a scraping noise like ice against wood. They turned slowly, their eyes widening in horror. The snowman was inside, its massive form blocking the barn's only exit. How did it get in? Lily shrieked. The snowman's arms stretched toward them, long and gnarled, like frozen tree branches. Ice spread across the floor as it moved closer, the temperature plummeting. Mason grabbed a pitchfork and lunged at it, but the weapon shattered against the snowman's icy body. It's not real, Claire shouted. It can't be. Tell that to it, Mason yelled, backing away. Claire's mind raced. If the snowman really was cursed, then maybe there was a way to break the curse. She remembered the old stories her grandmother had told. The snowman was said to appear only when someone disturbed the field on Christmas Eve. Maybe we have to fix it, she said. Put it back the way it was. What are you talking about? Lily cried. The coal eyes, the stones for the mouth, the carrot. If we put them back, maybe it'll stop. Mason and Lily exchanged terrified glances, but nodded. They moved quickly, dodging the snowman's icy grasp as Claire grabbed the stones and started rearranging them. The snowman let out an unearthly wail, its movements becoming more frantic. Hurry! Mason shouted, tossing a coal eye to Lily. Finally, Claire placed the last stone in the snowman's mouth, forming its original, neutral smile. The snowman froze in place, its glowing eyes dimming. The wind stopped and the barn grew silent. The three of them stood there, trembling, as the snowman slowly crumbled, collapsing into a pile of ordinary snow. "We did it," Claire whispered, barely able to believe it. The next morning, the townspeople found the trio huddled together in the barn, pale and shaken but alive. They tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed them. The field was empty and the snowman was gone. But Claire, Mason, and Lily knew better. And every Christmas Eve after that, they made sure to stay far, far away from Frost Hollow Field. Story 4. The small town of Pinehaven was known for its elaborate Christmas traditions. Each year, the residents decorated their homes with sparkling lights, and a group of carolers, dressed in Victorian attire, would sing door to door, spreading festive cheer. Their voices echoed through the streets, filling the frosty air with timeless holiday songs. But there was one unwritten rule everyone followed: never open your door to carolers after midnight. The rule wasn't discussed openly, it was just something people knew. No one could remember how the tradition started, but every household obeyed it without question, until one Christmas Eve. Rebecca had recently moved to Pinehaven with her husband, Mark, and their 10-year-old daughter, Sophie. They loved the town's old-world charm, and the Christmas festivities made their first winter there feel magical. That night, they hosted a small holiday gathering with a few friends, exchanging gifts and sipping mulled wine as the snow fell gently outside. As the clock neared midnight, the last of their guests left, and Rebecca began cleaning up. Sophie was already upstairs, tucked into bed, and Mark was dozing on the couch. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of Christmas music playing softly on the radio. Rebecca had just finished loading the dishwasher when she heard it, a soft knock at the front door, followed by the sound of singing. She paused, listening. The voices were beautiful, harmonizing perfectly in an old carol she couldn't quite place. "Carolers," she murmured to herself, wiping her hands on a towel. She glanced at the clock, 12:03 a.m. Her heart skipped a beat. Hadn't Mrs. Ellis, their neighbor, mentioned something about the midnight rule? Rebecca couldn't remember the exact warning, but it seemed silly to leave the carolers standing in the cold. Surely, they wouldn't still be singing if the rule was serious. Curious, she walked to the door and peered through the peephole. Four carolers stood on the porch, their faces partially obscured by shadow. They were dressed in Victorian-era clothing, just like the group she had seen earlier in the evening. One of them held a lantern, its flickering light casting eerie shadows on their faces. "Should I wake Mark?" Rebecca thought, but then she dismissed the idea. What harm could a few carolers bring? She unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The cold air rushed in, and the carolers stopped singing, turning to look at her in unison. Their eyes gleamed in the lantern light, and Rebecca felt a shiver run down her spine. "Good evening," she said hesitantly. "It's a bit late for caroling, isn't it?" The lead caroler, a man with sharp features and an unsettling smile, stepped forward. "We apologize for the hour, ma'am," he said, his voice smooth and melodic. "May we come in to warm ourselves? It's frightfully cold tonight." Rebecca hesitated, her hand tightening on the door. Something about their presence felt off. Their clothes, while authentic-looking, were immaculate, as if they had just stepped out of a museum exhibit. And their eyes, they didn't blink. "I'm sorry, but it's quite late," she said, forcing a polite smile. "Maybe another time." The man's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white. "It's Christmas Eve," he said softly. "We only wish to share our songs." Before Rebecca could respond, Sophie's voice called from upstairs. "Mom? Who's at the door?" Rebecca turned instinctively, and in that moment the lead caroler reached out, pushing the door open wide. The others followed him inside, their movements unnervingly fluid. "What are you doing?" Rebecca shouted, backing away. "You need to leave." The carolers ignored her. They spread out, their voices rising in unison as they began to sing again. The song was hauntingly beautiful, but the words were foreign, unlike any Christmas carol Rebecca had ever heard. The temperature in the house dropped sharply, and frost began to creep across the windows. Mark woke with a start, his eyes widening as he saw the strangers in their living room. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, jumping to his feet. The carolers turned to him, their singing never faltering. The lead caroler stepped closer to Mark, his smile unnaturally wide. "Join us," he said, extending a pale, bony hand. Mark grabbed a fireplace poker and swung it at the man, but it passed through him as if he were made of mist. The carolers laughed, their voices echoing like wind through a graveyard. Rebecca ran to Sophie's room, her heart pounding. She found her daughter standing by the window, staring out into the snowy night. "Sophie, we have to go," Rebecca cried, grabbing her arm. "But Mom," Sophie said, her voice distant. "They're so beautiful." Rebecca followed her gaze and gasped. Outside, more carolers were gathering, their figures silhouetted against the snow. There were dozens of them now, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. They surrounded the house, their song growing louder, more insistent. Rebecca pulled Sophie away from the window and rushed back to the living room, where Mark was frantically trying to light the fireplace. "They don't like fire," he shouted. "I think it's keeping them back." The lead caroler turned to Rebecca, his grin fading. "You should not have opened the door," he said, his voice low and cold. "The song must be sung." "What do you want?" Rebecca demanded, clutching Sophie tightly. "Your voices," the man said simply. To join the choir, Mark finally managed to ignite the fire, and the carolers hissed, their forms flickering like shadows. The lead caroler glared at them, his eyes narrowing. "This is not over," he said. "We will return." With that, the carolers vanished, their song fading into the night. The frost melted from the windows, and the temperature in the house returned to normal. But Rebecca, Mark, and Sophie knew they were not safe. Every Christmas Eve after that, they left Pinehaven before midnight, never risking another visit from the singing carolers. Story 5. The snowstorm came out of nowhere, a relentless blizzard that swallowed the landscape in thick, blinding white. Alex, a 27-year-old photographer, had been driving to her family's remote cabin in the mountains, excited to spend Christmas with her parents and younger brother, Ryan. But the storm had other plans. She could barely see the road ahead, and her car's tires slipped and skidded on the icy pavement. The GPS on her phone had lost signal miles ago, leaving her to navigate by memory. When she spotted the faint glow of a cabin through the swirling snow, relief washed over her. It wasn't her family's cabin, but it was shelter. Alex parked as close as she could, grabbed her backpack, and made a dash for the front door. The wind howled, biting at her exposed skin, and she banged on the wooden door with all her strength. "Hello? Is anyone there?" she called out. To her surprise, the door creaked open. Inside was warm and inviting, with a roaring fireplace and the faint scent of pine. The living room was decorated for Christmas, tinsel draped over the mantel, stockings hung in a neat row, and a beautifully lit tree standing in the corner. It was almost too perfect, like a scene from a Christmas card. "Hello?" Alex called again, stepping inside. She closed the door behind her, grateful to be out of the storm. "I'm sorry to barge in. My car." "No need to apologize, dear." The voice startled Alex. An elderly woman appeared from the kitchen, carrying a tray with a teapot and 2 mugs. She was short and frail-looking, with white hair pulled into a bun and twinkling eyes that seemed to hold endless warmth. "You're just in time for tea," the woman said, setting the tray on a small table near the fireplace. "You must be freezing. Come, sit." Alex hesitated, but the promise of warmth and tea was too tempting. She shrugged off her coat and sat on the plush armchair by the fire. "I'm sorry to intrude," she said again. "I didn't know anyone lived out here." "Oh, it's no trouble at all," the woman said, pouring tea into a delicate porcelain cup. "It's been so long since I've had company on Christmas Eve." Alex took the cup, feeling the warmth seep into her hands. "I'm Alex, by the way." "Edith," the woman replied with a smile. "It's lovely to meet you." The tea was fragrant and sweet, and Alex felt her nerves begin to ease. Edith chatted amiably about the storm, her cozy cabin, and the joy of Christmas traditions. But as Alex looked around, she noticed something strange. There were no personal items in the cabin. No family photos, no signs of anyone else living there. Just the pristine Christmas decorations. "Do you live here alone?" Alex asked. Edith's smile faltered for a moment, but she recovered quickly. "Oh yes, it's been just me for years now. My family moved away." There was something in her tone that Alex couldn't quite place. Sadness, maybe? Or was it something else? As the hours passed, Alex found herself growing drowsy. The warmth of the fire, the soothing sound of Edith's voice, and the lingering effects of the tea made her eyelids heavy. "You should get some rest, dear," Edith said, noticing Alex struggling to stay awake. "There's a guest room upstairs. You're welcome to stay the night." Alex hesitated. Something about the situation felt off, but the storm outside was unrelenting. Staying put seemed safer than venturing back out into the blizzard. "Thank you," she said, forcing a smile. "That's very kind of you." The guest room was cozy, with a neatly made bed and a window that looked out onto the snow-covered forest. Alex climbed under the covers, her body aching from the cold and the stress of the day. As she drifted off to sleep, a faint sound reached her ears, singing. It was soft at first, almost like a lullaby, but it grew louder, more insistent. The melody was haunting, the words indistinct but full of sorrow. Alex sat up, her heart pounding. She crept to the window and peered out into the night. Through the swirling snow, she could just make out figures standing in the trees. They were shadowy and indistinct, but there was something deeply wrong about the way they moved, jerky and unnatural, like marionettes on invisible strings. Alex stumbled back from the window, her breath coming in short gasps. She ran to the door, determined to wake Edith, but the hallway was empty. The house was eerily silent, the warmth from earlier replaced by a bone-chilling cold. "Edith?" Alex called, her voice trembling. No response. She made her way downstairs, the floorboards creaking under her weight. The living room was dark, the fire reduced to embers. The decorations that had seemed so cheerful now looked ominous, their shadows stretching and twisting in the dim light. Alex spotted Edith sitting in a chair by the tree, her back to the room. "Edith," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on?" Edith turned slowly, and Alex's blood ran cold. Her eyes were empty sockets, her skin pale and sunken. "You shouldn't have come here," Edith said, her voice hollow and echoing. "They've found you now." Before Alex could react, the singing started again, louder this time. The shadowy figures were at the windows, their faces pressed against the glass. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their mouths moved in unison, forming words Alex still couldn't understand. The front door burst open, and the wind howled through the cabin. The figures stepped inside, their movements deliberate and menacing. Alex backed away, her mind racing for an escape. "You must join them," Edith said, standing slowly. "It's the only way." "No!" Alex screamed, grabbing a poker from the fireplace. She swung it at the nearest figure, but it passed through as if it were made of smoke. The singing grew deafening, the voices surrounding her. Alex felt her strength draining, her vision blurring. She collapsed to the floor, the last thing she saw being the shadows closing in around her. When the storm cleared the next morning, Alex's car was found abandoned on the side of the road. There was no sign of her, and no one in Pinehaven could recall ever seeing a cabin in that part of the woods. But every Christmas Eve, travelers reported hearing faint singing in the forest, a haunting melody that sent chills down their spines. Some said it was just the wind. Others knew better.